Hi and Assalamu alaikum everybody. This is Namra Mehmood. Welcome to another special episode at the Narr. We have our very special guest today, Jon Danilowicz, who is basically a former diplomat and has served in the U.S. Foreign Affairs for 30 years. And with that, he has an expertise in the South Asian region, particularly Pakistan and Bangladesh. Welcome, Jon. It's really nice to have you here. We'll start off with the first question on a very lighter note. What keeps you so fascinated about this region, South Asia?
Sure. Well, I joined the U.S. State Department back in 1989. I was just out of university. I was a young person,
Mm-hmm.
and my first overseas posting was in Bangladesh. So I was bitten by the bug pretty early, and then over the course of over 3 decades, I had opportunities to serve 3 times in both Bangladesh and Pakistan. So my interest in the region is both professional and personal. My wife and I, during our foreign service career, had 3 children, four
Okay.
children who grew up overseas. For me, it's a unique perspective, having served in both Pakistan and Bangladesh. And my time in Pakistan, I had an opportunity to travel throughout the country as well. So to get an understanding of the complexity and the diversity of Pakistan as well as Bangladesh.
Recently, you heard about the death sentence of Hasina Wajid. Do you see her getting hanged or do you see her living in India for the rest of her life?
So, the interim government, led by Professor Mohammed Yunus, that came into office in August 2024, had 3 principal tasks.
Yeah.
The first was to provide justice to the victims, not only of July and August, but of earlier years during Hasina's reign. It also had an important responsibility to promote reforms and then ultimately to hold elections. So the trial of Sheikh Hasina and her former Minister of Home Affairs and the former Inspector General of Police was the first step on what will be a long journey, which will continue during this government and the next as well. There have
Yeah.
been some criticisms of the trial's conduct, which are understandable, including from those who oppose the death penalty in all cases. But there was an overwhelming amount of evidence that was provided by the prosecution, and I think there's little doubt in anyone's mind that Hasina is guilty of the crimes with which she was charged and then convicted.
I don't think there is a lot of threat to her because she's not living in the same country anymore.
Sure. I mean, the ultimate decision on whether Sheikh Hasina will ever return to Bangladesh is outside of the hands of many of Bangladesh. And as you mentioned, she currently has safe haven in India, although I'm sure that over time her presence in India will become increasingly uncomfortable for the Indian government,
Yeah.
particularly if it wants to develop a new relationship with a new government in Bangladesh. But there are
Yeah.
other steps that the government of Bangladesh could take. For example, there could be a concurrent jurisdiction where the International Criminal Court takes up her case. And I think also with all of the focus on Sheikh Hasina, people forget that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of her lieutenants, her henchmen, also accused of very serious crimes who are also seeking refuge in India. So I think it's a broader issue that India and Bangladesh will have to deal with.
You do realize that India has lost the popularity in Bangladesh.
Well, one of the things that became apparent in July and August of 2024 is
Yeah.
that younger people, this Gen Z,
Yeah.
see the world very differently from their fathers and their grandfathers.
Yeah.
So obviously, 1971 is an important moment in Bangladesh's history, and there was a
Exactly.
reality of the role that India played, the role the United States played, the role that others played. But by constantly referring back to 1971, I think the Awami League and its supporters missed the reality of what people cared about in 2024 and 2025. So it's a much different era. And I think the concerns of the people are much different. Whenever a politically significant figure is placed on trial or is put in prison,
Yeah.
it becomes complicated because, on the one hand, there's always a risk that the charges and the prosecution against them are politically motivated. We've certainly seen that before in Bangladesh and Pakistan and even elsewhere. But at the same time, being in political office doesn't absolve one of responsibility for their crimes. So again, ultimately, accountability is important, and ultimately, the people, whether it be in Bangladesh or Pakistan, deserve justice, whether they are accused of crimes or whether they themselves are the victims.
So recently, Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif, President Trump, right, to get better relations with the U.S. and we as a nation, we're looking forward to have better relations with the U.S. too. So what is your say on that? Like, how can Pakistan and US, get better together?
Sure. So Pakistan is an important country in its own right, and
Yeah.
it's obviously an important country for the United States. And we've seen throughout Pakistan's history that Pakistan matters to the US government. At times, the Pakistan relationship has higher priority, and at times, there are other priorities that compete for attention. During this Trump administration, clearly Pakistan has taken on increased importance on its own right. I don't want to say that Pakistan only matters because of other countries, but certainly Pakistan in its own right is an important country for the United States. What's
Yeah.
happening in the South Asian region is important for the United States, and then more broadly. And I think in particular, the role that Pakistan has played in the Middle East in recent times
Yeah.
also makes it a country that matters a lot to the United States. So I was pleased to see President Trump
Yeah.
have high-level engagement with his Pakistani counterparts and with other, influential individuals in Pakistan. And I hope that this means that the U.S. and Pakistan will be able to chart a stronger relationship going forward.
China is basically an ally to Pakistan. And at the same time, we want to reform better relations with America as well.
I'm now retired. I don't speak for the US government. I only speak for myself.
Yeah.
In my private life, I'm a student of history, and I've done some teaching in the past as well on history. So
Okay.
I say that as background because, what is happening with China in the world today is not the first time that there's been a similar phenomenon. I mean, China clearly is a rising power and has been now for some time. And
Yes.
in the international system, there are always shifts in the balance of power. At one point, Great Britain was the global power. The sun never set on the British Empire. The
Exactly.
United States was a relatively insignificant country. Over the 19th and 20th century, that balance shifted, and the US took on a more predominant role in the world system, and the role of the United Kingdom was diminished. That was a peaceful transition to the extent to which there was a transition from the British Empire to an American role in the world. So right now we're seeing a rise in China. And there's a competition clearly between the United States and China. There's a competition economically, there's an ideological competition, and there's a risk of a security competition. But there's no reason why that competition has to lead to conflict. So
Yeah.
everyone else in the international system is also affected by this dynamic. But one of the things that I think President Trump has done helpfully is he's reintroduced this concept of national interest. So just as President Trump says that the United States will pursue an America First policy, I
Yeah.
assume and expect that Pakistan will pursue a Pakistan First policy.
Yeah.
China will pursue a China First policy. India will pursue an India First policy. And
Obviously.
that each of these countries will find ways to advance their own interests, but in the context of this greater system. So all of our countries are going to interact. And I think that dynamic is one that will adjust over time. And I think one of the things that President Trump has been very helpful in is kind of breaking up people's preconceived notions that things were going on a certain trajectory and had to go in that trajectory. And now, in a sense, they've reshuffled the deck, and it's allowed people and countries around the world to take a fresh look at their interests. And I think, particularly if you look at the South Asian region,
Yeah.
I always laugh when people talk about South Asia and they talk about the smaller countries in South Asia. A
Yeah.
small country in South Asia is a huge country anywhere else in the world,
Yeah.
both in terms of population, in terms of economy, in terms of influence.
Yeah.
So I think it's important that the United States and others look at each country in the South Asian region individually. Clearly, there are connections. There is a region, and there are certain economic and other reasons why it makes sense to think about the region as a whole. But beyond that, I think the United States and others would be well served by looking at each country individually
Yeah.
and assessing interests and looking at ways to maximize interests in both countries based on that individual relationship. So, my
Yeah.
suggestion for Pakistan is that policymakers and people in the country, including the private sector, look at what can be done to strengthen Pakistan's foundation, look at what can be done to improve the lives of Pakistan's people, to provide economic opportunities, and
Yeah.
to adjust to a changing world. None of us understand, for example, the impact that the information technology revolution will have, particularly when it comes to artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
This will provide opportunities for countries, but there's also risks. So I think some of these issues looking inward are important. And I know that people in Pakistan are thinking about these. When I was in Islamabad, I attended the Sustainable Development Conference, and smart people from Pakistan and the region were there talking about these very issues. So I know these discussions are taking place and they need to continue.
Yeah.
The countries in South Asia and beyond share these challenges and I think would benefit from exchanging, experiences and working together. But I think also there's important opportunities to work with the diaspora communities. So just recently in
Mm.
Washington, D.C., there was a conference at Georgetown University, which was sponsored by the Pakistan Futures Foundation in coordination with Georgetown University. And that brought together a lot of Pakistani Americans who have been very successful in their field. So again, people won't have to agree on all the issues, particularly politics, but if everyone can agree that it's in the United States and Pakistan's interest to increase prosperity and increase the ties between our countries, then I think the Pakistani community in the United States is an important ally in that effort as well.
When it comes to Afghanistan, you see, do you think US would again be engaging into Afghanistan?
So, I mean, the U.S. will have engagement with Afghanistan just as we have engagement with every country in the world. I mean, by virtue of the United States' role in the world,
Yeah.
there are few, if any, countries that the U.S. can afford to simply ignore. Uh, but the level of our engagement and investment in countries will change over time. And certainly the Trump administration has signaled different priorities.
Yeah.
So I don't anticipate that the U.S. level of interest or engagement in Afghanistan will be anything approaching what it had been in earlier parts of this century. But the U.S. has important interests in
Yeah.
Afghanistan and the region.
Yeah.
And I anticipate that, the U.S. administration and its successors will, adjust based on developments on the ground in Afghanistan.
So, how do you see Pakistan and Afghanistan, the relationship after the recent conflict? How do you see that?
Yeah. So, relationships between neighbors are always complicated. The
Yeah.
United States relationships with Mexico and Canada are complicated and at times have led to, direct conflicts. I mean, the U.S., again, in the early years of our republic, there were military engagements between the U.S. and Canada, even.
Yeah.
And certainly the U.S. and Mexico fought wars.
Yeah.
But we've also found ways to cooperate. I think if you look at the history of Europe, if you look at Africa, if you look at other parts of Asia, there are always issues between neighbors. Neighbors can't change the fact that they're neighbors. People
Yeah.
share geography, there
Yeah.
are personal ties, there are economic ties, etc. So I think it's important that leaders in Afghanistan and Pakistan engage with each other, that they
Yeah.
have
Right.
frank discussions about their interests,
Yeah.
and ultimately, you know, every country's foreign policy depends on popular support. No government can act in a way over time that's contrary to what domestic opinion believes. So I think what's complicated for Afghanistan and Pakistan is the intertwined nature of their relationship over the past decades, the intertwined nature of their populations, and how they're adjusting to, some significant changes in recent years.
I think the leaders they need to sit down and have a word with each other.
Right. And again, whether it's between neighbors or between
Hmm.
others, I mean, there are obviously sources of friction and there are causes of conflict. I'm not so naive as to believe that we'll live ever in a world without conflict.
Yeah.
But ultimately, countries have to determine whether their interests are, best advanced through conflict or through cooperation. So
Exactly.
even some of the bitterest enemies. I mean, if you look at Europe, if you look at France and Germany, for example,
Yeah.
for centuries, or even France and the United Kingdom for that matter, for centuries, including in the 20th century, some of the world's bloodiest conflicts were fought, between these countries, which today have very different relationships because of changing circumstances.
Yeah.
So that's not to say that, that South Asia is about to turn into Europe and that we'll see a South Asian Union like we've seen a European Union.
Yeah.
But it also shows that, nothing is written in stone, that the relationship between two countries is never defined by the past. Again, with Bangladesh, Bangladesh and Pakistan have a history. What
Yeah.
happened between 1947 and 1971, and what
Exactly.
happened in 1971. So it's important to remember this history. But what happened, 5 or 7 decades ago doesn't has to define what's going to happen today or what's going to happen tomorrow. So I think leaders need to keep the past in mind, but to take actions which are based more on the future rather than the past.
It was an honor to have you here on the podcast. I really enjoyed.
Thank you very much. Pakistan holds a special place in my heart. It was fantastic to be able to return to Pakistan recently,
Yeah.
and I'm certain I will be back. And I look forward to, visiting other parts of this, fantastic country that I haven't been to before. And, I look forward to continuing our conversations going forward.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.